Okay, so I know you must be wondering another demand supply video. But well, this is not just different, but I personally find it a very interesting topic. So what essentially we'll be doing today is we'll be joining the forces of demand and supply. Okay, so you might be wondering why another demand and supply video? Well, first fact is there's still a lot of topics and concepts that we do not know as of yet of demand and supply. But the other thing that I would like to say is the topic that we'll be doing today is not just a very important, significant, and different topic from the ones that we have covered before, but I personally feel that it is one of my most favorite parts of this entire concept of demand and supply. And what we'll be doing is today we'll be joining the forces of demand and supply. So yeah, up until now we have discussed demand individually, what happens when somebody demands, how does price affect demand, how do non-price quantities such as tastes and preferences, such as number of buyers and sellers, expectations regarding the future, price of other goods, that is essentially the set par conditions, affect demand. And we have done the same for supply. So we have discussed how prices and non-price set par conditions affect the supply curve, how do we move along the supply curve, and how do the supply and demand curves essentially shift. But demand and supply are essentially two halves or two faces of the same coin. They cannot exist individually. They need to interact with each other. They need to communicate with each other. And that is how the market forces govern the entire system of an economy. In fact, market-based economics rely on these market forces of demand and supply to rectify and to correct the externalities that we'll be talking about. We'll talk about them soon in future videos. But they essentially rely on these forces of demand and supply to essentially launch and guide their way to development and progress. So this essentially is a very important portion that we'll be studying today. So up until now, we know how the demand and supply curve looks like, right? So in this diagram, we have quantity plotted on the horizontal axis. So since I have put here quantity, you can of course guess that we'll be talking about both quantity demanded and quantity supplied. But let's take baby steps. Let's look at the things one at a time, and let's look at different perspectives of the same problem. So in this diagram that we have, price is plotted on the vertical axis, and the quantity demanded for the time being is plotted on the horizontal axis. We know that from the law of demand, when price of a good increases, the quantity demanded of that good falls, and vice versa. That is, when the price of a good falls, the quantity demanded rises. So there's a negative relationship between price and quantity demanded of a good, and that is how we justify that there's a negative slope. So essentially the demand curve is downward sloping. And we know that supply curve is essentially an upward rising line, or an upward rising curve essentially, which is justified by the fact that when price of a good increases, the quantity supplied of that good also increases, and vice versa. That is, when the price of a good falls, the quantity supplied of a good by a producer or a seller essentially also falls. So this is essentially what we call the law of supply, and we have again discussed it before. So that is what we have until now. Now, what you can see is, if I look at it from two different perspectives, when I'm talking about the demand curve, then at this price, this is the quantity demanded. 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 And similarly, at the end, we have at this price, this is the quantity demanded. So that's from the demand perspective. Now let's look at the supply perspective. So at this price, this is the quantity supplied by the producer. At this price, this is the quantity supplied by seller, which is the same as the producer. At this price, this is the quantity supplied. And at this price, this is the quantity supplied. Finally, at this price, this is the quantity supplied. Now, if I join the two perspectives, I can say that at this price, when I'm looking at the demand side of the market, that is when I'm talking about the buyers, the economic agents of buyers, this is the quantity demanded by buyers. However, when I look at it from the perspective of supply, that is when I'm talking about economic agents as sellers or producers, I can see that at this price level, pertaining to this supply curve, this is the quantity supplied. So at this same price level, I can see that the quantity supplied and the quantity demanded is this amount. So essentially at this price level, quantity supplied equals quantity demanded. Now, let's say in a market, there are a lot of buyers and a lot of sellers. I'm not concerned with the number of buyers and sellers, but what I realize is at the market, the total amount or the total number of, I don't know, books that are offered by the producers for sale is exactly equal to the total number of books that are that the buyers or that the consumers are willing to buy. So doesn't that essentially mean that that will only be the case when the transaction is possible? We will find out why. So essentially what happens is this point where the supply curve and the demand curve essentially intersect each other is called the equilibrium point. So at this point, the price point is called the equilibrium price, and this is called the equilibrium quantity. So note that I'm calling this equilibrium quantity because this denotes both equilibrium quantity demanded and equilibrium quantity supplied. So at this price level E, the quantity demanded equals the quantity supplied. And Px is what I call the equilibrium price, and Qx is called the equilibrium quantity, which is either the equilibrium quantity demanded and equilibrium quantity supplied. And as I mentioned before, E refers to the equilibrium point. So that is the point where essentially the demand curve and the supply curve intersect each other. Now let's find out why I am calling this the equilibrium point. So this is called the price adjustment mechanism. So why essentially we have a particular point where the price allows the demand quantity demanded and the quantity supplied to lie exactly at the same position, and why is it called the equilibrium point? That is justified by something called the price adjustment mechanism. So let's say instead of the market price being at Px, let's say it's at a higher price level. So let's say the market price is this amount. So we draw a line which well corresponds to the market price. So let's say not Px, but this price is the relevant market price. So at this market price, when I'm looking at the demand side, this is the quantity demanded by the buyers or by the consumers. And when I'm looking at the supply side, this is the quantity supplied. So at this price point, this is the amount that is offered, that is required by buyers or consumers. And this entire amount, so let's just, So this is the amount that is required by buyers, and this is the amount that is offered by sellers. So you see, buyers require a small amount, but the sellers are willing to pay or essentially offer for sale a larger amount. So let's say I particularly want only 2 books, but the seller wants to sell essentially 4 books maybe. So that may be because the seller has overstocked books, so he wants to go with the flow and sell the books so that he can bring in new stuff. So there are reasons why then this might happen essentially when the price is above the equilibrium price. So at this particular price level, this is the amount of quantity demanded by buyers, and this is the quantity supplied by sellers. Now, what happens is this amount. So this amount essentially is what I call excess supply. So, this is the quantity demanded and this is the quantity supplied. That means that quantity supplied exceeds the quantity demanded. Sellers are willing to sell more than buyers are willing to buy. So this amount, this horizontal distance between the demand curve and the supply curve is what we call excess supply. And this excess supply is also called surplus. So this essentially refers to a situation in which the quantity supplied is greater than the quantity demanded. That is what I talked about. In this situation of excess supply, price of the good falls, because let's look at it from the side of a seller. So the seller has to sell his goods, and the buyer is not willing to buy those goods. So the buyer is like, I want to buy only 2 goods, but the seller keeps on insisting, please buy 4 books. I need to get over with this stock. So the rational action of the seller would be, okay, you don't need to pay me this much amount of money. You can pay me a lower amount of money. Just take the books. I'm giving them to you at a lower price. So what happens is the seller is essentially lowering the price. So that is why we say that the price of the good falls. So that is what I've said here. The price of the good falls because the seller is very desperate to get on with the selling of the books. And that is why he drops the price. Now we know from the law of demand that when price of a good falls, the quantity demanded rises. So that's what happens, the quantity demanded rises. How do we say that? So as you can see, when the price falls from here, what happens is we move along this direction when I'm talking about the buyers. So since demand refers to the buyers, the buyers move from this point essentially to this point. So the buyers, when initially at this point, they were willing to buy this much amount of good. But as the price kept on decreasing, they were like, okay, the price is decreasing. How about I increase my quantity demanded? So they move along this curve and they keep on increasing the amount of quantity that they demand to this position. And what happens is they keep on moving towards point E. Next, what happens is, again, referring to the law of supply, we know that when price of a particular good falls, the quantity supplied also falls. So this and this share a negative relation. This and this share a positive relation. So when price of the good falls, quantity supplied also falls. That is from the perspective of the producer or from the perspective of the seller. So now let's look at the seller side. So let's look at the supply curve. What happens is the seller thinks, well, prices are dropping. Yes, I wanted to sell away my goods, but since I am actually offering lower price, maybe I don't want to sell 4 books. Maybe I want to sell, I don't know, maybe 3 books. I don't want to sell my 4 precious books at such a low price. I want to sell them at a little bit higher price. So yeah, I did say that I want to sell all the 4 books at a lower price, but nah, I want to sell just 3. So the seller essentially moves along this direction. Well, the red line camouflaged, but essentially the seller moves along this direction, and what he does is he keeps on decreasing the quantity that he offered for sale at the given price. So the buyer moves in this direction and the seller move in this direction. They both move towards equilibrium point E, and this keeps on happening. So let's say the buyer is at this situation and the seller is at this situation. So the buyer is at this situation and the seller is at this situation. There's still an excess supply and they again keep falling below. What happens is when they reach this point, there's no more excess supply. There's no surplus. So this entire process, is essentially triggered because there's an excess supply. So as soon as they reach the point E, there's no more excess supply. This excess supply essentially vanishes. It disappears from their life. So what happens is this entire system, essentially it's called the price adjustment mechanism. This mechanism stops working. And what happens is they both get stuck at equilibrium point E. So even if I start from any other price level, I'll essentially get both the buyer and the seller moving towards this point. Essentially, that is why I call E to be the equilibrium. It's equilibrium. It's a sort of the midpoint between a seesaw. No matter which position you start from, the midpoint is always the equilibrium point. Again, there might be a situation of shortage. So let's say we have a situation where the market price is below the equilibrium price. So in the first case, we talked about a market price which was above the equilibrium price. And now we'll be talking about a market price which is below the equilibrium price. So what happens is at this market price, it's a low market price. So sellers are like, this is too low of a market price. I cannot offer so much for sale. So I'm willing to sell a very small amount to the market. But the buyers are like, oh my God, it's such a low price. I want to buy more of the good. And what they do is they start demanding larger quantities of good. So this is the quantity that sellers are willing to sell at the given market price. And this is the quantity that buyers are willing to buy at the given market price. What happens is, again, there's an excess demand this time. So demand is offered, demand is from the side of the buyers and supply is from the side of the sellers. So as you can see, the buyers want to buy more than the sellers are willing to sell. So this causes an excess demand. And this excess demand is also called shortage. So it's essentially a situation when the quantity demanded is essentially, quantity demanded is essentially greater than the quantity supplied. So quantity demanded is essentially larger than the quantity supplied. Now what happens is, due to this excess demand, price of the good rises. So now what happens is, these sellers look at the situation from this way. Well, my buyers want to buy more from me, but I have limited amounts. So what I can do is, I can raise the price. So they are willing to buy more as it is. Why not extract as much as money as I can from them? So, sellers are also rational individuals. Rationality is what we assume in this case. They want to maximize their profits. They want to maximize their revenues. And what they do is, they obviously increase the price. So as I mentioned before, they increase the price of the goods. So excess demand causes an increase in the price, right? So we move in this direction this time. And what happens is, the law of demand again comes into force. And since the price of the good rises, there's an inverse relationship. So the quantity demanded falls. Again, quantity demanded refers to the buyer side. So we look at the demand side of the market. And what I see is, the buyers are like, why are the sellers increasing their prices? I wanted to buy so much because the price was low. If they keep on increasing the prices, I won't buy so much. I'll buy less. And they keep on moving in this direction until they reach this point. I think you can kind of guess what the rest is going to happen. So yes, pertaining to the law of supply and the positive relationship between price and quantity supplied of a good, the sellers will be like, yeah, I increased the price of a good, so I'll be supplying more. I want to, incur more profits. I want to earn more profits. I want to earn more revenues. I want to sell more. I'm already raising the price. Why not? So what happens is, the price rises, the buyers move in this direction, the sellers move in this direction. For any price level below the equilibrium price, there still exists an excess demand situation which keeps on triggering this price adjustment mechanism until they reach this point, which was meant to be a straight line, and they reach this equilibrium point when there is no more excess demand. This mechanism stops working and they reach at the equilibrium point. So again, E is the equilibrium point. So essentially what happens is, whether the price be above or whether the price be below the equilibrium price, the market will always adjust itself pertaining to the demand law, which is essentially the force of demand, and the supply law, which is essentially the force of supply. And these forces of demand and supply will always navigate the market towards the equilibrium point, where the price is such that the quantity demanded equals the quantity supplied. And this entire mechanism is called the price adjustment mechanism. There's a small note that I would like to say regarding this price adjustment mechanism, is the fact that this price adjustment mechanism also has a second name. So this price adjustment mechanism, the fact that the forces of demand and supply always work together to navigate the market towards the equilibrium point, this entire concept also has a name called the invisible hand. So it's like there's an invisible force that navigates the market towards the ideal situation where the objectives of the sellers and the buyers are fulfilled at the same time simultaneously. And this invisible hand is essentially a metaphor for the unseen forces that move the free market economy. So this invisible hand is part of something called the laissez-faire policy, which we'll be talking about in our future videos. This essentially means let do or let go. It's an approach to the market essentially. In other words, the approach holds that the market will find its equilibrium without any government or any other interventions forcing it into unnatural patterns. And this invisible hand term, it was coined by the Scottish Enlightenment thinker Adam Smith, in his book An Enquiry into the Nature and Causes of Wealth of Nations, published in 1776. And this term was found used in the economic sense during the 1900s. So I have talked about Adam Smith in my previous videos. I think it was in my introductory video of economics. He was one of the most influential economists, and he has probably laid the foundation of economics. So this market force, which is also called invisible hand, which is a great important component of the laissez-faire policy, is a very important topic. in the entire market forces and demand supply concept.